Welcome, everyone, to the 11th episode of the PlainGains podcast. Today we have a super special guest. We have Dr. Derek Wilcox. Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and promote anything you'd like to promote?
Well, as you said, I am Dr. Derek. Now, I am a coach for Renaissance Periodization. I've been with that company for about 10 years now. My strength sport experience goes back all the way to, I guess, when I was 13 or 14. I started doing lifting competitions while I was in high school. And I competed particularly in powerlifting for a little over 15 years, 10 of which was in the professional ranks. I've competed in Highland Games, still do that from time to time. A little bit of strongman. I'm 5'6", so that's not the greatest sport for me. But Olympic weightlifting, several competitions with that. And I feel like I'm forgetting one. Compete in jiu-jitsu now, disc golf as well. So I definitely look like a standard disc golfer. About 215, 220 and short. So not too many fire hydrant looking folks out there on the course.
That's great. Juan, you want to kick it off with the questions we had?
Absolutely. Yeah, it definitely is, especially when you're getting started. I'm not sure. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the belt ranks, but we start at white. Well, as soon as you walk in the door, you get a white belt. Then you're promoted to blue, then purple, brown, then black. The energy expenditure is actually much higher for lower belt ranks because of the lower levels of experience. So when you see a white belt roll for 2 or 3 times in a class, they're usually completely exhausted and can't really go anymore. When you look at brown and black belts, they're usually able to roll 5 or 6 times and have that same kind of fatigue set in past that point. And it's purely because of skill and technique making things way more efficient. It doesn't necessarily have that much to do with your physical endurance. It's more about knowing what to do to save your own energy and make your opponent expend theirs. So with that said, it was definitely harder early because I'm a blue belt now. I've been training about 4 years. So as time has gone along, it's become much easier to balance lifting because I'm not accumulating as much fatigue in jiu-jitsu class. But fortunately for me, I guess, my PhD is in sport performance and physiology, so I had a really good idea of how to monitor things. So my dissertation was actually about monitoring powerlifting for a para-powerlifter, trying to find new methods of doing that since most of the athletic monitoring methods are jumps and squats and things like that. So there aren't too many jumps and squats happening in disabled powerlifting.
Right.
So I understand how the fluctuations work. I do my own personal monitoring with strength work and heart rate analysis and things like that, variability. So I was able to find a balance pretty quickly, personally.
So right now you're doing jiu-jitsu, and are you also strength training, or are you what's your weekly schedule kind of look like when it comes to training of any sort?
Well, I'm getting ready to go do Masters Worlds. So my training is very much specifically going towards that. I'm going into the last last month of training for that, and now I only lift, if you could call it lifting, twice a week because my jiu-jitsu volume is way, way higher than normal. I'm going to 6 or 7 different sessions a week for jiu-jitsu, and the little bit of lifting that I do is primarily power development, rate of force development training, and plyometrics. So I'm just trying to be fast. I don't need to gain muscle. I've already gained the strength. I did that, over the years, obviously, but my last strength work happened about 2 months out, which was fun because it was like a small powerlifting meet that I got to do, which I really miss being able to do it more than anything, but it's fun to lift heavy, of course.
That's interesting. I guess it's kind of cool that you get to take more of a periodized approach to training for a sport, because usually you hear less professional athletes just doing a constant program for their sport. But I guess martial arts is more similar to strength and hypertrophy training, where periodization might be useful for preparing for different things.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's in our grad program for my master's and PhD. I got to work under Dr. Mike Stone, who was considered the Western godfather of block periodization. He and Yuri Verkhoshansky in Russia, the Soviet Union at the time, were coming up with very, very similar methods through similar research means. But I know Dr. Stone doesn't speak any Russian. I'm not sure how good the English was for Dr. Verkhoshansky, and their publications were in the opposite language. So they were kind of in a double-blind setting there, finding the similar truths through research and training. Lots and lots of training studies and lots of physiology work in the lab, and it was really cool in the 80s when their works were able to be compared against each other. They basically had the same ideas, just very different terminology for it. So in any sport, you can periodize the training leading up to it if you know your schedule. Even if you don't know it exactly, you can have an idea of the most important times you need to have your maximum physical preparedness specific to your sport, and you can deprioritize other competitions or small training times where your performance isn't as vital to success, and work on other attributes that you need to potentiate further gains closer to the big competition.
So that's actually a really great transition into one of my questions that I get often, is if you're just like a average lifter, let's say you've been lifting for 2 or 3, 4 years or whatever, and you want to do a powerlifting competition, but you have no experience doing strictly strength training, and there's no defined date for when you're going to do a powerlifting competition, just sometime in the foreseeable future, how would you suggest that person transition their training into more powerlifting strength focus? How far out should they be? And how should they periodize their training in order to get prepared for this show?
Well, as believe it or not, as the concepts that I learned in my education got more and more complex, my training got more and more simple. And that was kind of a relief, because I was probably trying to overcomplicate things when I didn't know as much. We start learning what the big things are, the really important things, and you start tossing away the things that you do that don't actually matter and might actually be hindering you. So later in my powerlifting career, I was training, I think, 2, maybe 3 days a week in the last months going into competition, because 1, my body really needed the time to recover, and 2, I was able to toss out a lot of the useless work that just kind of got in the way. You could call that junk volume. I focused in on what I specifically needed, and I was able to really lower my injury risk because of that. And luckily, I went through my powerlifting career without any major injury or having to get surgery or anything like that. And I'm honestly as proud of that and being able to compete at a high level for over a decade as I am as any numbers that I was able to achieve in that time. So for that specific question, for the beginner, I usually plan out training in 4-week blocks, and the month leading up to the competition is mostly 1s and 2s on your primary compound lifts, practicing your skill for that specific sport. The block before that is usually around the 3-rep range, and we get to focus in on that higher intensity work, getting up close to 90% of a 1-rep max in the last week for a triple. The block before that's 5s, the block before that's 10s, and usually before that is 15, so you can kind of see how that progresses towards a competition.
So then in that final month before the before the competition, are those singles and doubles a high RP, a low RP, or what kind of a mixture of both? What kind of RP should we be shooting for there?
Well, the intensity waves upward throughout the block. So the first week, a lot of people do deloads at the end of a block, and they just repeat what they did the previous week with 20 or 25% less intensity and knock off a few sets. I like the 4-week blocks because they fit into schedules really well, and I actually use the first week as the deload week, but I go extra light, down to 65% of what you're going to end up lifting on week 4, just so we can introduce exercises, because that accumulates fatigue quickly because your muscles aren't as coordinated for those. And if you do them very lightly, you can get that initial neural adaptation for coordination and doing the exercise as well, and not kill yourself to where you can't really recover for the rest of the block. That's a pretty big mistake a lot of people do. They just go way too hard in the first week.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. One other question I had was, it's just a thought, I don't know if it's actually true, so it's great to get your opinion on this, is whether you think it's more important for beginner strength athletes to do accessory work than more advanced strength athletes. My kind of rationale behind this is that the beginner athletes, the main differentiator between the different beginners is how much muscle mass they have, whereas the advanced trainees, it's less of a muscle mass. They're probably almost maxed out at their weight cap. It's more so just like repetition and getting stronger, improving your motor pathways to lift more weight. What do you think about that?
Believe it or not, it depends. A lot of times, advanced lifters, they can get away with just doing their compound lifts to a certain degree, but as you get stronger and stronger, especially relative to your own size and body weight, the weights you have to lift on those big compound movements accumulate a lot more fatigue than they did when you were an intermediate or a beginner. So a lot of times you can go to accessory movements that are less stressful and less fatigue accumulating and still get good progress without increasing your injury risk and without really messing up your intensity progression in a block. A lot of times beginners can get away with killing compound lifts over and over and over again, and for tons of volume, at least volume as in sets and reps, and recover well and still get lots of progress. But when you're a beginner, you can do most anything and get lots of progress.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that makes sense. I've seen that a lot for myself, at least with like deadlifts. Back when I was in year 1 of training, I could do deadlifts twice a week, and now in year 8 of training, it's pushing it at 1 time a week. Anymore, I'd be too fatigued to lift the same weight again. So yeah,
I hear you there. That's very true. Are we specifically talking about powerlifting still? Okay. So one of the biggest issues that I've seen with powerlifting athletes is low back arch strength, like lumbar spine integrity during lifts. It's one of the first things to go, and there's multiple factors that go into that. Part of that is your hip mobility, because the antagonistic tension in your hamstrings and your hip extension muscles in general, and your adductors particularly, and the strength of your abductors, being able to force your knees outward. All those things work against literally pulling your pelvic girdle under into a posterior tilt. So it means you're losing your low back arch. So you have to have well-established low back arch strength and good mobility, at least good enough to where that doesn't compromise that strength in the bottom of a squat or your starting position in a deadlift. And what I've focused for myself, especially later on, and for lots of my clients who do powerlifting meets or just want to have good powerlifting numbers in general, is focusing on movements that hip hinge, and we focus almost specifically on maintaining that low back position. And when you do that, you can engage your hamstrings and your glutes and adductor magnus, etc., to such a large degree that your mechanics stay very sound, your hip extending and knee extending at the same time, which in layman terms means your butt doesn't shoot up out of the bottom when you start coming out of a squat or right at the beginning of a deadlift. And you can do that with like stiff leg deadlifts, not straight leg but stiff, good mornings, and all the other hip hinging type movements. So I really focus on that a lot, regardless of the level of the lifter. because you can really build your primary lifts by getting just that down by itself, and you're really ahead of the game. Probably 95% of the powerlifting world does not do that at what I would consider an acceptable level. And it's hard to get there because you have to, I mean, there's a lot of stretching, and powerlifters are definitely not known for stretching, but that's being able to hit proper positions and maximize your efficiency as far as force transfer from your feet to the knees, through the hips, into the spine, and into your shoulders where that bar is going to be, is absolutely massive. And I really contribute that to me being able to out squat a vast majority, if not all, my competitors at different times.
Yeah, that's great. And then, so I do have one question specifically about the deadlift. I see a lot of people either on one side of the spectrum on whether like thoracic spine flexion is okay during a deadlift, whether it's efficient, not efficient, or whether we should not have it at all. I just kind of wanted to get your thoughts and stance on the thoracic flexion during a deadlift.
Well, if you watch throughout history, people like Ed Cohn or Tom Eisman was a great example of this. His thoracic spine would round like crazy, but a lot of great deadlifters were able to do that. If you watch people lifting stones in strongman, their thoracic spine's always completely in flexion, at least to a very large degree. And the thicker your waist is, the more it has to be in flexion for your arms to be able to wrap around the stone. So there's not really a big risk there. If you can do that and at least keep your lumbar spine neutral, you can gain a lot of leverage on the range of motion, especially the starting position with your leverages on a deadlift. But the problem is you're making a trade-off there. When your thoracic spine is rounded, once the bar gets above your knees, you have to have the technique or the strength to come out of that position. But it's usually a lot easier to do if you have good technique. And as long as the low back's in good position, there's no real injury risk. There's just that trade-off of it's harder to lock out if you have that mid-back flexion, or if you hold it more steady off the ground, then it's a lot easier to lock out, but you have that trade-off of it being harder off the floor.
Yeah, that makes sense. I always like to say that the erector spinae muscles, particularly the longissimus, is really good at extending the spine. So having it a little bit more long with some thoracic flexion is probably not going to be a bad thing. And a lot of people might get some extra pounds out of their deadlift with that extra lengthening and shortening that would occur in moving from lateral flexion, or moving from thoracic flexion to extension, or I guess like neutral position.
Absolutely. There are other ways to manipulate your torso in that regard as well. Bob Peoples was known for this, and Vincenello, through my discussions with him, he said that back in the 70s, people would actually completely exhale before they started pulling their deadlift. They'd take a breath, hold it, and push it all out right before they start pulling, because it decreased the rigidity and the expansion of the rib cage, and it actually made your torso a little bit shorter. So you were able to have a little bit higher shoulders relative to where the bar is starting, and it gave you a little bit more leverage there. Now, I'm not saying that that's for everybody, but how I implemented that in my own deadlifts, and I wasn't, an extremely great deadlifter, it was decent, but I would get into that super tight position with a real big breath, wedge into position, start to pull off the floor, and by the time the bar got to my knees, I would actively push out all the air that I had to shorten my range of motion. And it made actually a difference of locking out 3 to 4 inches lower than normal.
That's interesting. I've never heard that before. I'll have to try that out next time I deadlift.
Well, just make sure if you get a hernia, you don't blame me.
Yeah, no, I'll sign the waiver.
All right. Sure, one of the greatest deadlifters ever, and probably will remain one of the greatest deadlifters ever. Lamar Gant had extreme scoliosis, but the issue with that specific condition is that it's so variable in the shape of the spine and how it's all distorted that there's no one answer for that in the least. Someone can have a form of scoliosis that completely inhibits their life, like they can't hardly walk. But then you have people like Lamar Gant, and there are several others just like that, where they start deadlifting and their torso compresses to the extent because their spine is so malleable and out of position that it almost looks like their nipples hit their hip bones when they walk out. So there's so much variability there. There's no right wrong answer, and like you said with trade-offs, to me, at least in my eyes, there are no solutions. There are only trade-offs. But for everyone's specific body types and so many other different variables that are included with strength sports, some trade-offs just seem so easy to make that they seem like, okay, well, this is just right. We're like, no, there's always a trade-off one way or another, especially if you understand the biomechanics and the physiology behind it. It's just some are just extremely favorable versus others.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of trade-offs, that's a pretty good transition into the strength training variables and the trade-offs between them. So for hypertrophy, we know it's relatively simple with frequency. It doesn't really matter as long as volume's equated. But with strength, definitely some people say that frequency matters a little bit more, whether you're getting extra practice with different lifts, whether you can get higher total volume with managing fatigue. I'm sure your answer is probably it depends, but do you have a general rule of thumb of how you balance frequency, volume, whether it's an advanced or beginner trainee in strength sports?
Yeah, it definitely depends. Most of that has to do with individual mechanics. Like I said, when I was at my training peak in competing for powerlifting, I only trained 2, maybe 3 times a week. But I did spend a lot of time on mobility so that I didn't have those antagonistic tensions that were going to pull me out of perfect form. So if you ever watched my squat, and granted it was a very criticized squat because I could squat wider than everyone, I could squat more upright than everyone, but the reason I could do that is because I focused on being able to hit those positions. I was in a much more mechanically efficient position, and even though I wasn't lifting that frequently, especially going into competition, I did a ton of mobility work to make sure that I could do that. Now, beginning lifters, they need general practice on hitting those positions to build those motor patterns, to be able to hold a low back arch, to push those knees out, to keep their spine integrity in check. And there's so many things that you have to practice over the years, and I definitely did that earlier on. I did plenty of frequency, and I actually got made fun of apparently in the gym when I was very young, just because I would go practice with a bar, and I would practice not just looking like I was doing a squat, but feeling it, pulling tension into my hamstrings with my low back arch particularly. I would go do a stretch and see how that felt the next time I went to go do another lift. I would mess with all those little variables, see what they felt like, and then I was able to hire the greatest coach that there's ever existed, and that's a video camera, and watch and see exactly what was happening, compare that to what I felt. It was like, okay, I thought this was happening, but this is clearly not what's actually going on. So you can rearrange your perceptions, and if you want the 10-cent word to share at your next party, it's proprioception, being able to feel your body in space. It really refines that drastically. And doing it with a video camera is way, way better than staring at yourself in a mirror while you do it, because you start looking at your positions and your feedback becomes visual instead of proprioceptive. Mm-hmm. So feel what you're going to feel during your lift, review it on video, and then you actually have a good idea, because if you're watching yourself, you're going to start doing other things and you're not as in tune with what your body is feeling.
Yeah, that's great advice with the video over the mirror, and I think that applies to pretty much everything, whether it's posing for a bodybuilding show or practicing your golf swing. I think the video is going to be the way to go every time. So that's great advice.
Aside from putting on makeup in the morning, that doesn't
Yeah,
work as
that's
well.
true. I have limited experience with that, but maybe I should try it out for the next one.
Hey, you never know.
Yeah.
Yes. Yep. And it only makes your ability to perceive your body in space that much better. You're more coordinated, and everything gets a lot more refined pretty quickly.
That's great. So, in that explanation, you kind of touched on a little bit of how you were doing a lot of mobility work when you were in your peak for your strength training. Do you want to tell us about the story of your road to the 1,000 pound squat?
Well, it started, I guess, when I was 12. Uh, my dad had always really told me stories and been really impressed with really strong people forever. And that was just something that I wanted to pursue. And I was very small. I was actually a couple inches taller than I am now when I started high school, and I was about 105 pounds. So I had to try and gain lots and lots of weight to try and put on muscle, blah, blah, blah. Just like a lot of people have that similar story. But when I started really understanding what powerlifting was, I found the all-time world records list, and that list just had weight classes and the biggest squat, bench, deadlift total that had been done at that weight class. It did not discriminate between federations. It didn't discriminate against anything. It's just that's the biggest number. So I said, that is really cool. And I would sit around at school because I would print that list off every time it got updated, and I'd stick it in my notebook. So I would look at it and say, where can I get on here one day? And I eventually was able to do that in the 181 class, and I squatted 935, which was an all-time world record at that time. And that stood for 6 or 7 years until a guy from Finland, I can never pronounce his name correctly, he ended up beating it, and I think it still stands for him today. So an all-time world record standing for 6 or 7 years is pretty great. And then 3 years after that, in 2014, I always felt like the 935 squat, when I saw it on video, lo and behold, it looked different than it felt. And I wanted to have something to back that up. Just, an all-time world record is supposed to say, I'm the best in human history to ever do this one specific thing. And I didn't feel like I had that solid of a claim because of the quality of the lift. And that happens. Apparently the judges got a little excited, and the depth wasn't quite there for the 935. So when I attempted the 1,000-pound squat, I was actually really happy because obviously I'm in multiply equipment, and all the judges were committed raw lifters. So they had their own perceptions of what equipped lifting was, and they definitely made me go down to a good depth, and it felt great. My shoes broke on that lift, actually. I was wearing double ply Converses, Chuck Taylors, and when I went to go for my next lift, I tried to unrack 1,060, which would have been the all-time world record at 198, and my shoes just split on the bottom, like the stitching between the sole and the canvas sides was already broken, so I couldn't even stand up with it. So it was a very, very strange feeling lift because it felt like I was just sliding all over the place with 1,000 pounds in my back. But that lift specifically is definitely what I'm known more for, I guess, because commas are a whole different deal when you lift them. But that was really it. It was I was definitely more proud of that lift in general, and that gave me a lot of validation. Like, okay, this was a real thing.
So, wait, the Converse split when you unracked or when you began squatting?
It happened sometime during the 1,000-pound squat. I assume when I'm coming up.
Okay.
You can see my heels slide a little bit.
Yeah.
My right heel specifically. So I felt like I was going to fly up with it out of the bottom. And when I pushed, it felt like the floor just gave out from underneath me. And I assume that was when my shoe was ripping apart.
Yeah.
So that was the last competition I wore Chucks in. After that, I had to go to the metal squat shoes that had the reinforced sides and double Velcro and soft rubber on the bottom. So
That's
those
interesting.
were great
I
shoes.
wonder how much more weight you would have been able to lift if the shoes were intact enough to not lose the force that you were placing laterally through the sides.
Oh, I could have squatted 1,400 pounds, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Just kidding.
Yeah.
Not at all.
No, of course. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's one of those little mysteries I guess we'll never know.
Yeah. We'll just draw the force diagram, figure it out.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely noticed it. The big thing that I always tell people when what does that feel like? I said, it's a lot of squish. And if you ever watch the videos when I'm setting up, because it's in a model lift, and as the squat weights got heavier and heavier, the bar rack height had to get lower and lower. And it wasn't because I was, getting shorter, I needed more room out of the rack. It was because it compressed my spine that much more. And eventually, the starting rack height relative to my torso was like below my nipples. So when I unracked it, the bar just barely got out of those hooks, and I was 6 inches shorter than normal just because of that compression.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it makes sense given the spinal discs are kind of like sponges that just compress, and when you have 1,000 pounds on your back, it just compresses probably to a flat sheet of paper. And you're probably bone on bone at that point. So
something like that, yeah.
Yeah.
But thankfully, with my technique and all that mobility work and all those things, my positioning really allowed me to keep my spine completely vertical underneath that load. So instead of leaning over and creating that spinal flexion, or at least even going to neutral very much, it didn't allow an opportunity for those discs to get pushed out posteriorly in between the vertebrae and create herniations and things like that. So I think that says a lot about technique, spine integrity, and working on the mobility, because I was able to avoid all those problems even with weights with commas in them.
Yeah, for sure. And that's honestly one of the things I tell people when they're like scared of specific movements that train their spinal erectors or muscles that surround the spine, is that when you actually do train those muscles, they become better at supporting that whole entire spinal column. So you're probably, I don't really have data to support this, but I'm going to assume less likely to get injured because you have a stronger support base. Of course, obviously, if you like miss position or whatever and you move in like a weird way, of course something can always happen. But I would say on average, if you have a stronger spinal column muscles surrounding the spine, you're probably going to be less likely to suffer some injury.
Yeah, definitely. And there's plenty of mechanical variance on that just with genetics. Some people just have more solid spine integrity than a lot of other people. Not talking about their character, but the actual mechanics of it. An interesting anecdote with that, in 2006 or 2007, I think it was 2007, I went to the WPO Super Finals at the Arnold Fitness Festival, or Sports Festival, and Alexander Kutcher from Ukraine was there. And I believe he still has the all-time record at 165 for deadlift. That was 794. And I watched him do that in person, and it was probably one of the biggest things that changed my perception about what was possible in strength sports. This 165er deadlifted almost 800 pounds, and it looked like it took him about 5 minutes to do it, but he never gave up on it, and he eventually got it. And the next year, because he did that in 2006, the next year we saw him, and one of my friends asked him, "Hey, Kutcher, what do you do for your back?" Because it looked like giant globs of clay were just thrown on his back because there was so much muscle packed into that little frame and that torso. It just didn't make any sense. And his first thing that he said for strength in general was lots of sex. But past that, he would take an 80-kilo kettlebell and stand on top of 2 benches and reach as far down below his feet as he could with a rounded spine, and then stand up, and he would do 100 reps with that about every other day.
Yeah, so it's kind of like a Jefferson deadlift almost.
something like that. I'd call it a Kutcher deadlift because he's
Yeah.
small.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, as long as the weight, you don't want to go start with 80 kilos on something
Right.
like that. You could start with just the bar and still develop a fair amount of hypertrophy in your back along those spinal erectors. And I did that quite a bit and was able to build my back strength up quite a bit that way. But you first have to build muscle in general. Then you can train that muscle later on with the strength work and the high intensity work. Get those neural adaptations to go with the added muscle contractile tissue to compound, and everything comes together and you have really, really good numbers.
Yeah, that's a great point. So that's almost like, I guess you probably suggest for more novice powerlifters to run some more extended hypertrophy blocks. Of course, with the three main lifts probably still, but maybe more hypertrophy style training.
Yes, definitely. The big difference between a beginner's powerlifting hypertrophy training and the hypertrophy training of like a bodybuilder is a lot of its intent. Make sure still, even though it's high volume, you're still moving at 100% force production on your pushes and your pulls, regardless of what the weight is over time, because that small difference of instead of a 60% effort weight and putting 60% into that, just enough to get through it and accumulate your volume that you need for the workout, if you put 100% effort into that, you're going to really make small differences over time that accumulate a ton in those muscle fiber types. So you get much farther on the type 2X end of the type 2 muscles instead of type 2A, which are kind of like a diesel motor. It's high torque but really low speed, and they take longer to engage once you start initiating them. And getting really fast muscle fiber engagement is a huge deal in powerlifting as well as other sports.
So that leads me right to my next question. Do you think speed work has a place in powerlifting training? And if so, how should it be implemented, and what sorts of protocols should people be using if they're trying to implement speed work?
Are you referring to any specific training methods with that? Or
Like speed work as in like, uh,
likely, yeah. Yeah, I absolutely have. Rate of force development is incredibly important in sports in general, and it's likely underestimated in powerlifting, because if it takes a long time for you to recruit all those fibers, because if you think about when you've watched heavy deadlifts, people in competition, they start pulling and the bar doesn't go anywhere for a second, maybe two, sometimes even three. And we've seen in research with isometric pulls that sometimes people don't actually peak in their force production pulling isometrically for 3 seconds. And they just keep pulling and pulling and pulling and pulling. And that's why we don't see deadlifts always fly right off the floor. A maximum effort deadlift is going to take every muscle fiber that you've got. And they don't come all at once. So rate of force development is directly related to how fast you can recruit those muscle fibers. That's a lot about the neural adaptations, and when you do speed work, specifically, if you do it correctly, you enhance the neural adaptations of motor fiber recruitment that much faster, or motor unit recruitment, not fiber. It gets to the muscle fibers eventually.
Yeah.
But you train those motor units to fire in a higher magnitude, which engages more muscle fibers in a shorter time period. So when you think about it that way, if you're in good position and everything is equalized mechanically, that is a gigantic advantage, because you can give 100% effort immediately when you try versus it being 95% effort, and then eventually 1-2 seconds later, then it becomes 100%.
So do you think this has application to, or I guess that's not really the right way to phrase my question. So if you were to compare like doing speed work in the way that Juan said, like with a really light weight, and just going for actual like how fast you're moving, of course, going as fast as possible with good technique or whatever. Do you think that has any advantage over just doing your normal training with the intent that you're going to lift the weight as fast as possible with good form? Or is it not really matter?
Yeah, the big thing there, the difference, is you're going to give 100% either way, but it takes much longer to do a higher percentage lift because of the load. It's a force velocity profile, where heavy loads with the same amount of force applied to them move slower. It's basic physics. Lighter weights move faster, so you have less time under tension over 100% effort magnitude of moving intent. So when you draw that out under heavy loads, you accumulate a ton more fatigue. And it also, when you accumulate more fatigue more often, it can start dulling training adaptations, because you cannot really start developing the maximum adaptations until after you have recovered. That's why we have training tapers and intentional overreaches that go in before those. You overreach, you recover, and when you get back to baseline, you feel good, you feel like you're ready to lift, but it's going to be another few days, usually 3 or 4, until you get that super compensation effect, where your tissue is remodeled enough and your nervous system is primed to be at its absolute best in responding to the previous training that you've done.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess the way I was kind of looking at it was like, if you're going to do like a set of 3 with 60% and just go for practicing moving fast versus like a set of 3 at like 80% or something like that with the intent of moving fast. Like, yeah, the 80% is going to be higher fatigue, but I was like, I don't know if the 60% is worth anything. Like, does just moving fast help you develop a unique skill that applies to a 1 rep max, or is it not really matter as long as you're moving as fast as possible and managing your fatigue accordingly?
Well, that goes into one of the big, more frequent mistakes I see with training with lighter percentages, and that is loosening up your technique in the effort to move fast. You don't move fast for fast's sake. You move fast within the confines of the specific technique that you are going to use in competition. So, with that said, when you have faster muscle or motor unit recruitment in that specific technique, then that has a really, really big carryover over time, because you're accumulating less fatigue, you're allowing your body to recover and adapt. 2 separate things there, folks. And when you go back to heavier work later on, you'll be more refreshed and you'll be able to lift harder and perform better just a little bit over time, and that accumulates and accumulates and accumulates. It's not quite an exponential curve, but it's a pretty significant difference.
That's great.
Yes. Yeah, you have to train that explosiveness within the confines of the exact technique that you're going to be using. Low back integrity is one of the first things that goes when people try to lift really, really fast just for the sake of moving a barbell fast. And you can get away with a lot at those lighter percentages and start building maladaptations neurally, the bad technique. And it starts showing up if you're not disciplined in your training, especially at those lighter percentages.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I just wanted to add one thing for people, at least for myself. I'm sure you guys have also experienced this. You don't want to make your lighter work too light because, at least for me personally, if it's too light, it's just impossible to get the technique that I'm aiming for because my body can't move in that particular motion because it's just not enough weight to be conducive to that movement pattern, if you kind of know what I'm saying. An example of this would be like if you needed to get a little bit of extra range of motion on a leg press and you can't get it without adding a couple of plates on to like get your adductors to be warmed up enough to stretch it out. You don't want your speed work being too light that you can't get into the right positions.
Yeah, sometimes load is needed to get into positions. We actually went over that a fair amount with Dr. Stone and his program with the Olympic weightlifting movements. Sometimes, like to get into a good overhead squat, because there's a lot of mobility involved there. If you do it with just a PVC pipe, there's not enough load to actually get tension in the muscles to stretch far enough to get into a full overhead squat a lot of times. Sometimes it takes the bar, sometimes it takes 40 kilos, 60 kilos, whatever it is. Everyone's going to be different there. But powerlifting squats are very similar. Bench press not quite as much, depends on your mechanics, blah blah blah. But with a squat, when you actually get maximum tension into a squat form, and your low back does not give away, and you're squeezing as tight, that 100% tightness with one plate on the bar, sometimes 2 plates on the bar. If you can squat a lot more than that, you're not going to get the depth because you're pulling so much tension into your hamstrings and glutes and everything else that they're just going to bind up, and the only way for you to get lower is to round your lower back to some extent. So you're definitely correct there. Sometimes load is important for practicing good technique at proper depth and other skill specific things.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head with the squat. I know for me, if I don't have enough weight on the bar, my tibialis anterior is just going to be super tight and not allow me to squat to full knee flexion unless I can get it stretched out with some load. So that's a great point.
Well, the primary thing you see when the low back is pulled out of position in the bottom of the squat is the hips shoot up first, especially under higher intensity loads. And when you think about that mechanically, if you watch the hip angle, which is just drawing a line from the knee to the hip to the shoulder, you have an angle created there. When someone's hips shoot up out of the bottom of the squat, there is almost no hip extension happening. That angle remains the same until the hips stop going up out of the bottom. That is because they're only doing knee extension, because that low back integrity is what holds your hip in place and allows your glutes and hamstrings to contribute largely to the lift. So, if you think about it, to get out of the bottom of a squat when you've lost position, you're only using your quads. The bar's not moving very much. It's only your hips that are moving because you're just extending your knees, and you have to good morning out of that position. Now, when you're put into that position and the heavier the load gets, your posture integrity breaks down more and more, and that in general makes the limiting factor your back strength. Whereas if you can hold that position, you have proper mobility, you don't have that breakdown. And one of the big things that happens with is a low bar position, because I always used a very high bar position so I could stay perfectly vertical. And it had lots of advantages, especially for equipped lifting, but when I was lifting unequipped or just belt and knee wraps, I still did the same thing. because I wanted to keep my hips as engaged in the process as I possibly could, and their mechanical advantages with keeping a completely vertical spine. That's a lot of times when you see people squatting with a low bar position, that hip angle closes drastically in the bottom of the squat, and the smaller that hip angle is, the more tension there is on the low back, pulling it out of position. So you'll see those hips kick up a lot. But the low bar position gives you a lot more mechanical leverage with the weight being closer to your center of gravity, and you can power through things a lot. Now, it's not the greatest thing mechanically, in my opinion, but being able to hit perfect position is not an easy thing either. So it's a lot easier just to go low bar, sink your squat, shoot your hips up, and power out of it, especially with those higher percentages. And I think that's where a lot of people end up going, just because it's simpler. I don't think there are a lot of people that teach squat the way I do or performed it the way I do or did. So that's what you see most of the time. It's a lot simpler and easier approach. When you take somebody who's squatting high bar and they're sinking their squats down low, and it's like, why don't you move it to low bar? And they squat 30, 40 more pounds. It's like, oh, I guess that's the way you do it. So it makes sense why you see it the most.
Yeah, I also think a lot of it just comes from the fact that a lot of people have really strong like glutes and adductors, which you can get a larger moment arm in a low bar squat position just because of the way your body is moving. You can kind of move a little bit more force there. But of course, there are going to be some individuals that are going to have super strong quads and favor a high bar position. One thing I do want to add with the lower back rounding is that I think you lose a lot of force development out of your glutes when your lower back rounds, because you're going from the glutes getting longer, and then once you kind of like drop into that position where your pelvis rotates like this, your glutes actually get shorter. So, I mean, I don't have data to support this, but I think that would make the glutes fire less hard and you wouldn't be able to produce as much force, which is probably why you see the quads taking over, shooting the hips up, and then good morning back up like that, is just because your glutes and adductors can't really extend the hips very well.
Correct. You are essentially broken mechanically when your low back comes out of position, because that is what's holding your hip girdle in position, holding all the tension in your hamstrings and glutes for hip extension. So we actually saw this specifically in my undergrad when we were doing biomechanics research, and we had EMGs on quads, hamstrings, and glutes. I think that was it. We had two different ones on the quads, but when we actually did research on squat suits, we could see the difference between people, and this wasn't what was published, it was just what we could visually watch and see on the EMG data. When I would go down, there was never any break in the hamstring EMG data. Like, it was always very, very high. But other people who would have to round their lower backs to get below parallel, especially with a suit on, their hamstring activity was very minimal. And it didn't pick up until after their hips had kicked up to get back into a position where they could engage their hips with their back. So when that happens, you're very correct. The hamstrings and the glutes are no longer being pulled to a more lengthened state as you go down. They stay either at the same length or they could get shorter, like you said. But either way, they're not in a position to mechanically contribute to the lift, and that's why you only see knee extension out of the bottom and not hip extension being paired with it.
Yeah.
Well, the first recommendation that I have for everyone is to pay me lots of money to coach them. And that's priority number one. But past that, videoing yourself so that you can actually put those things together, what's actually happening and what you're perceiving, is incredibly powerful. when you see things like your knees coming in out of the bottom of a squat, you'll have a good idea that your adductors are likely tight and or your abductors are not strong enough to hold that position. That also happens when the low back rounds in general, because adductor magnus has a dual purpose of being an adductor and a hip extender due to its twin origin points. One literally pulls like a hamstring and the other is an adductor. And when that muscle is tight specifically, then you will see those knees come in when hip extension is trying to be introduced out of the bottom of a squat. So you know you can work mobility there. If you're not seeing that, but the hips still shoot up, a lot of times it's hamstring tightness, or your low back's just not strong enough to hold all those things. It's always a marriage of those different mechanics and tensions and strengths. So being able to find those things in your own lifts, understanding the principles, and at the very least go learn some anatomy. That'll feed into biomechanics later, but you've got to know what tools you're working with before you know how to use those tools. I mean, I'm not going to go jump into the engine of a top fuel dragster and start turning screws and wrenches and making adjustments, because I don't understand how all those parts and pieces work together. You have your body, you know what you feel, now start learning about all the different parts involved in your top fuel dragster. You know, you have to know where things are pulling and where they're trying to go to, and the direction of force development for all those muscles create that total package. So learn those things. It's absolutely invaluable, or at the very least find a coach who can take you through those things, and specifically pay me lots of money.
Yeah, that's a great point. You guys can pay me lots of money too. If you're interested in learning anatomy, I'd be happy to teach it to you. Yeah, that's great. So I think that's a pretty good place to wrap it up there. Do you want to promote your Instagram or any other place people can reach you and find your coaching?
Certainly. On Instagram, I am at Wilcox Strength Inc. You can find me on Facebook with business pages the same name. Add me as a friend on there too. Feel free to reach out. I'm always up for taking questions. I enjoy them. The more questions that I can get, whether it's from a client or not, one, it'll help you, and hopefully as well, even if it's the same question I've heard a million times from other people, you might ask a question in a different way that makes me think about it in a slightly different way, slightly different perspective, and it helps me dig into research literature in a better way that helps me expand as a coach. So you're not just asking for your own benefit, you're likely going to help me as well. So everyone, please feel free, reach out, start a conversation. I'm here for it.
Great. So thanks everyone for listening. We'll link all of Dr. Derek's stuff in the description. Make sure to like the video and leave us a rating or a comment below. And stay tuned for the next podcast that should be coming out shortly. Thanks everyone. Bye.
Appreciate it, guys.